I thought I would read, I thought I should take my watch off. You know how there are those people who don't talk enough? That is not my problem. That is not my problem. I'm the person you want to shut up. I thought I would read a little and talk a little bit about the book. You know, when you, whenever you write a novel, you're something of a magpie, and you're putting together all sorts of different things from different parts of your mind and your life and your what you've learned, and in that sense, people say, what was the inspiration of the novel? And you can't really answer because there were many. At the same time, people ask that question a lot, so eventually you make up a fictional story about what actually was the inspiration for the book. And so in my case, I've come up with four sort of, and they aren't the only things, but they are all things that I was thinking about or was concerned with when I was writing this book. And so I thought what I would do is read a few passages and tell you a few of the things. If you know anything, and you may well not, but if you know anything about The Woman Upstairs, which is narrated by a woman named Nora Eldridge, who's a school teacher, you know that she's angry. I feel like that's one of the things that people have heard about Nora Eldridge, is that she's angry. And she isn't angry the whole way through the novel. The novel's told retrospectively, so she's angry at the end, which means that she's angry at the beginning, because she's angry when she starts telling the story. But actually what she's telling is the story of a year in her life, and she's telling it when she's 42, which it's about her 37th year, and it was a year that was a year of wonder and discovery and delight and happiness and productivity, and her anger is sort of commensurate with what she feels she risks losing or maybe has lost. She's a school teacher who always wanted to be an artist. She says at one point, there are two things that I knew I wanted when I was young. I wanted to have kids, and I wanted to make art. And I don't exactly not have kids, because I have a classroom full of kids, but I leave them at the end of the day every day. And I don't exactly not make art, but I make it in my spare time in the spare room of my apartment. She's somebody who has spent much of her early 30s caring for her mother, who has died, and has come to feel that, you know, maybe everything's passed me by. Maybe I'm not going to be able to do what I want. And then this family comes to town. There's a boy in her class. His name is Reza Shahid. His father's name is Skandar. His mother's name is Serena. They're visiting from Paris. The dad is Lebanese. The mom is Italian. And the mom is an artist. And the mom asks if Nora would like to share a studio with her. And so begins a year of thrills and spills for Nora. But so why don't I start by, another thing I'd say, you know, so this book is about anger for me. I was just, see, I hadn't even got to the point I wanted to make. As a reader, I've always loved a rant. I don't know how many of you have read Dostoevsky's Notes from Underground. How many people have read it? A few. Okay. So I read that in my senior year in high school, and along with a lot of other great books, and I had not known that fiction could be this too. That fiction could be your innermost, most unseemly thoughts, that fictional characters were allowed to be unabashedly selfish and perverse and grumpy, and it seemed both amazing and sort of hilarious to me. And I've found many hilarious ranters over the years, but they've all been men. So I felt like, well, if I can't find the girls ranting, I've got to make one up. So I made up a ranting girl. So so there she is. And another thing that the book is about for me is it's a midlife book. It's not a book I could have written or could really have imagined when I was in my 20s or even my early 30s. And there's this, you know, we live in a culture that allows us to be young for longer than any other humans in the history of the world, right? We have a longer lifespan. We have children later. We have more economic freedom. So a lot of people's 20s are spent not that differently from their college years, you know, doing a job, of course, but having a fair amount of free time, some disposable income, and hanging out with their friends. And you can really keep that sense that it's all ahead of you. You can keep that going for a long time, but there comes a moment where you can't. Sorry, young people. There comes a moment when you can't anymore. I mean, even as I say that, I feel like my grandma, she was young till she was 94. So, but at some point you sort of realize that not everything you thought you would do is going to happen. And that's when some people, you know, buy a red sports car, and some people have an affair with their secretary, and some people travel around the world, and Nora makes art, it's the sort of soundtrack to it. There's a Marianne Faithfull song called "The Ballad of Lucy Jordan." That was in Thelma and Louise, if you ever saw that movie. And the lyrics go, at the age of 37, she realized she'd never ride through Paris in a sports car with the warm wind in her hair. And for Nora, what happens is that she has sort of come to that moment and thought maybe she won't ride through Paris. And then actually, along comes this family, and she's like, you know what? Paris is mine. So, it's not entirely simple. The last thing I'd say about the midlife thing is, you don't know that you've hit the midlife thing until after you have. You know, in Anna Karenina, there's this poignant thing about Karenin, Anna's husband, that he had passed the peak of his career and everybody else knew it but him. And that's a sort of, I knew it when I was teaching. I sort of discovered it when I was teaching because I had kids. And when I was 32 and 33, before I had kids, at the end of class, the students in the class would say, do you want to go out for a drink? And then, you know, there was a time when I had a little baby, and then I had a toddler and another little baby, and nobody was saying, do you want to go out for a drink? Because, of course, I was going home to the babies. And then the kids got a little bit bigger, and there was this moment I was like 39, 40, and I was, you know, class is ending, I was, good night, good night. And somewhere in between, while I was sort of child minding, I had gone from young to old. Like the students had changed, but they hadn't changed that much, in the sense that they were still the same age that the students had been when I was 30. But when I was 33, I was somebody you'd go out for a drink with, and when I was 40, I was somebody you said good night to. So I didn't know it. I didn't know it was happening until after it happened. Beware. So I'm going to read now from the beginning. And this section, this is the ranty section, and it came whole like a marble. It was sort of too big a marble, and I had to whittle it. Can you whittle a marble? You could try. It might not work out so well. I don't know.
We get the end.
Yeah, you know what I'm saying. You know what I'm saying. Is swearing okay? I didn't ask. All right. How angry am I? You don't want to know. Nobody wants to know about that. I'm a good girl, I'm a nice girl, I'm a straight A, straight-laced, good daughter, good career girl, and I never stole anybody's boyfriend, and I never ran out on a girlfriend, and I put up with my parents' shit and my brother's shit, and I'm not a girl anyhow. I'm over 40 fucking years old, and I'm good at my job, and I'm great with kids, and I held my mother's hand when she died after 4 years of holding her hand while she was dying, and I speak to my father every day on the telephone, every day, mind you. And what kind of weather do you have on your side of the river? Because here it's pretty gray and a bit muggy too. It was supposed to say great artist on my tombstone, but if I died right now, it would say such a good teacher, daughter, friend instead. And what I really want to shout and want in big letters on that grave too is fuck you all. Don't all women feel the same? The only difference is how much we know we feel it, how in touch we are with our fury. We're all furies except the ones who are too damn foolish. And my worry now is that we're brainwashing them from the cradle, and in the end even the ones who are smart will be too damn foolish. What do I mean? I mean the second graders at Appleton Elementary, sometimes the first graders even. And by the time they get to my classroom, to the third grade, they're well and truly gone. They're full of Lady Gaga and Katy Perry and French manicures and cute outfits, and they care how their hair looks in the third grade. They care more about their hair or their shoes than about galaxies or caterpillars or hieroglyphics. How did all that revolutionary talk of the 70s land us in a place where being female means playing dumb and looking good? Even worse on your tombstone than dutiful daughter is looked good. Everyone used to know that. but we're lost in a world of appearances now. That's why I'm so angry, really. Not because of all the chores and all the making nice and all the duty of being a woman, or rather of being me, because maybe these are the burdens of being human. Really, I'm angry because I've tried so hard to get out of the hall of mirrors of this sham and pretend of the world, or of my world on the East Coast of the United States of America in the first decade of the 21st century. And behind every mirror is another fucking mirror, and down every corridor is another corridor, and the fun house isn't fun anymore, and it isn't even funny, but there doesn't seem to be a door marked exit. At the fair each summer when I was a kid, we visited the fun house with its creepy, grinning plaster face 2 stories high. You walked in through its mouth, between its giant teeth, along its hot pink tongue. Just from that face, you should have known. It was supposed to be a lark, but it was terrifying. The floors buckled, or they lurched from side to side, and the walls were crooked, and the rooms were painted to confuse perspective. Lights flashed, horns blared, and the narrow, vibrating hallways lined with fattening mirrors and elongating mirrors and inside-out, upside-down mirrors. Sometimes the ceiling fell, or the floor rose, or both happened at once, and I thought I'd be squashed like a bug. The funhouse was scarier by far than the haunted house, not least because I was supposed to enjoy it. I just wanted to find the way out. But the doors marked exit led only to further crazy rooms, to endless moving corridors. There was one route through the funhouse, relentless to the very end. I have finally come to understand that life itself is the funhouse. All you want is that door marked exit, the escape to a place where real life will be, and you can never find it. No, let me correct that. In recent years, there was a door, there were doors, and I took them, and I believed in them, and I believed for a stretch that I'd managed to get out into reality, and God, the bliss and the terror of that, the intensity of that, it felt so different. Until I suddenly realized I'd been stuck in the funhouse all along. I'd been tricked. The door marked exit hadn't been an exit at all. I'm not crazy. Angry, yes. Crazy, no. My name is Nora Marie Eldridge, and I'm 42 years old, which is a lot more like middle age than 40 or even 41. Neither old nor young. I'm neither fat nor thin, tall nor short, blonde nor brunette, neither pretty nor plain. Quite nice looking in some moments, I think is the consensus. Rather like the heroines of Harlequin romances read in quantity in my youth. I'm neither married nor divorced, but single, what they used to call a spinster, but don't anymore because it implies that you're dried up, and none of us wants to be that. Until last summer, I taught 3rd grade at Appleton Elementary School in Cambridge, Massachusetts, and maybe I'll go back and do it again. I just don't know. Maybe, instead, I'll set the world on fire. I just might. Be advised that in spite of my foul mouth, I don't swear in front of the children, except once or twice when a rogue shit has emerged, but only sotto voce and only in extremis. If you're thinking, how can such an angry person possibly teach young children, let me assure you that every one of us is capable of rage, and that some of us are prone to it. But that in order to be a good teacher, you must have a modicum of self-control, which I do. I have more than a modicum. I was brought up that way. Second, I am not an underground woman, harboring resentment for my miseries against the whole world. Or rather, it's not that I'm not in some sense an underground woman, aren't we all, who have to cede and swerve and step aside, unacknowledged and unadmired and unthanked. Numerous in our 20s and 30s, we're positively legion in our 40s and 50s, but the world should understand, if the world gave a shit, that women like us are not underground. No Ralph Ellison basement full of light bulbs for us. No Dostoevskian metaphorical subterra. We're always upstairs. We're not the mad women in the attic. They get lots of play one way or another. We're the quiet woman at the end of the 3rd floor hallway whose trash is always tidy, who smiles brightly in the stairwell with a cheerful greeting, and who, from behind closed doors, never makes a sound. In our lives of quiet desperation, the woman upstairs is who we are, with or without a goddamn tabby or a pesky lolloping Labrador, and not a soul registers that we are furious. We are completely invisible. I thought it wasn't true or not true of me, but I have learned I am no different at all. The question now is how to work it, how to use that invisibility to make it burn.
To make it what?
Burn. Burn. So that's how she's feeling. You know, there was, when I was working on this, I was in Germany for a year, and on a fellowship in Berlin. And I read that bit at the Institute, which was full of sort of serious Teutonic academics, and a guy came up to me, a sort of austere Dutch anthropologist in his 60s, came up afterwards and he said, "I'm so glad you read that." And I said, "Oh, thank you very much." And he said, "You know, when I was growing up, I never saw my mother angry." He said, but at the weekends, she would do the house cleaning, and she would go upstairs after breakfast, and my father and we children, we would stay at the table downstairs, and she would go up, and as she was changing the sheets and sweeping the floors and cleaning the bathroom, we would hear her swearing at the top of her lungs. We'd just hear her cursing and cursing and cursing. Then she would come down smiling, and we would all pretend we hadn't heard, and life would go on. So I felt that if I know Nora's not his mom, but I feel like if I gave Nora a voice, I mean his mom a voice for, you know, then that was a good deed, I hope. So another thing that the book is about for me, and this is not necessarily a gendered thing, although it is gendered in some ways, is the artistic gamble, and how hard it is to make that leap to be an artist, and how many people who are very creative and who feel that they actually have a lot to give artistically don't feel able to do it. And there are lots of reasons. There are practical reasons, you know, but financial reasons, personal reasons, family reasons. But you know, if you think about it, it's a sort of, you're going to say to the world, okay, I know you thought I was going to be a productive member of society, but actually I'm not going to earn any money, and I would like you, if possible, to pay me so that I can stay in my room and make something nobody wants or needs. A couple years, maybe 5, maybe 10. Sound good? How about that? And strangely, especially one's parents don't generally say it's a good idea. But it takes a certain, even if all the practical things align and to make it possible, it takes a certain chutzpah, right? It takes a certain hubris. It takes feeling that you have something that is more important than anything else that you could be doing. And that's where I think the situation is somewhat different for girls and boys, or women and men. And I think of it in terms of, I have a daughter and a son, and watching them even when they were small, and our son is the younger one, but when little boys go to nursery school, it was my husband who observed, it's sort of like they're going to the office. So they go in and they hang up their jackets and they say, hey Bob, hey Tom, hey Jack, and then they go in a corner and like make a racetrack or a Lego tower, and maybe they work in groups of 2 or 3, or maybe they work alone, but it's just not that fussy a business. They just get on with it. Whereas the girls have a table in the middle with paper laid out and markers, and the girls come to the table and they sit around the table and they draw and they talk. And you know, the talking involves socializing in a way that the boys are not at that moment engaged in socializing, and it involves pecking orders and judgments. So it involves both the conversation about, I haven't seen that blouse before, is that new? Lucy, where did you get that? Or is that a flower that you're drawing? Because it doesn't look like a flower to me. You're using brown. Is your flower dead? Right? There's that version. And when they get bigger, they move away from the table, and you see them in the playground on the monkey bars, you know, while all the boys are playing football, and the girls are sitting and they're jabber, 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 and that same social imbrication is going on. And then later, when they're parents, that goes on at the school gate, where the mothers say, see Mary, that's the first time I've seen her all term. She hasn't picked up her kid once. She sends a babysitter every day. And she didn't give any money for the holiday presents, and she didn't give anything for the potluck. What kind of mother is Mary, right? So that goes on the whole time. The girls, when you're small, you can step away from the table and play with the boys. That's allowed when you're small. But at some point, you're supposed to come to what is by now a virtual table, and you're supposed to be part of that community. And if you don't, you're a traitor. You're somehow bad. There is a moral judgment that goes with it. So I think for women to make that leap, to step away from the table, is actually a very particular gesture. You know, we don't have a myth of a semi-autistic female genius. We have a lot of semi-autistic male geniuses, a lot of them. And, I mean, there was an article in the New York Times not long ago about how son is my son a genius is Googled 100 times for every time it's Googled for a girl. Is my daughter pretty? So, you know, yes, feminism, you know, egalitarianism has done a lot, but there are certain sort of underlying cultural, situations that make the artistic gamble, I think, a little different for young women than for men. So, which pertains to this next little bit, I'll read. Don't worry, I realized I flipped it like 50 pages. I'm not going to read 50 pages. Certainly my mother, unlike my father, instilled in me the sense that unpredictability was essential. Not to be like your neighbor, that's everything, she would say. And because of this, because of the bright flame of her, it took me a long time to realize that she, too, was cautious and bourgeois, frightened of the unknown, and so uncertain of herself that she could hardly bear to make a mark. How else could she have stayed resolutely wedded to the ordinary, to my father, to the carefully ordained and unchanging routines of Manchester by the Sea? And it explains much about me, too, about the limits of my experience, about the fact that the person I am in my head is so far from the person I am in the world. Nobody would know me from my own description of myself, which is why, when called upon, rarely, I grant, to provide an account, I tailor it, I adapt. I try to provide an outline that can, in some way, correlate to the outline that people understand me to have, that I suppose I actually have at this point. But who I am in my head, very few people really get to see that. Almost none. It's the most precious gift I can give to bring her out of hiding. Maybe I've learned it's a mistake to reveal her at all. So, from our ordinary family in our ordinary house, a center entrance colonial with its potted geraniums on the stone porch and its charmingly untended yew hedges nibbling at the windows, I made my way out into the ordinary world, to the local elementary school, the local middle school, the local high school. I was popular enough, universally liked by the girls, even liked when noticed by the boys, though not in a romantic way. I was funny, ha, not peculiar. It was a modest currency like pennies, pedestrian, somewhat laborious, but a currency nonetheless. I was funny in public, most often at my own expense. Education was different then, and I was good at it, and so I skipped grade 9, went straight from 8 to 10, which was socially a little tough at first, and sealed my fate as a disastrous math student. I never learned the quadratic formula and other important tips from 9th grade math, just like I missed the early dating essays and the classes in how to navigate a school dance. At the time, though, I wasn't embarrassed about any of this, not embarrassed to be thrown sink or swim into the second year of high school without so much as a map to the cafeteria or a primer on how cliques were lined up, or even a list of the names of my new classmates, all of whom knew one another and some of whom knew me as their little sister's friend. No, I was proud because I knew my parents were proud, because it was an elevation and a revelation of the fact that I was special. I'd long suspected it, and now I knew for sure I was destined. When you're a girl, you never let on that you are proud, or that you know better or that you're better at history or biology or French than the girl who sits beside you and is 18 months older. Instead, you gush about how good she is at putting on nail polish or at talking to boys, and you roll your eyes at the vaunted difficulty of the history, biology, French test and say, oh my God, it's going to be such a disaster. I am so scared. And you put yourself down whenever you can so that people won't feel threatened by you, so they'll like you, because you wouldn't want them to know that in your heart you are proud and maybe even haughty and are riven by thoughts, the revelation of which would show everyone how deeply not nice you are. You learn a whole other polite way of speaking to the people who mustn't see you clearly, and you know you get told by others that they think you're really sweet, and you feel a thrill of triumph. Yes, I'm good at history, biology, French, and I'm good at this too. It doesn't ever occur to you as you fashion your mask so carefully that it will grow into your skin and graft itself, come to seem irremovable. When you look at the boy Josh, who skipped the grade alongside you, and you see him wiping his nose upon his sleeve and note his physical scrawniness, his chin's bloom of acne next to the other 10th grade boys with broader chests and clear square jaws, when you observe that he still takes his lunch with his old 9th grade friends, all of them boys in black t-shirts with glittered decals across the breast that say KISS or AC/DC, all of them with pimply chins and wet lips and hair as lank as seaweed, you cannot see any triumph in him at all. He seems clearly to have lost, to be a loser, because anybody knows that in the challenge you were given when you skipped a grade, social success, modest social success to be sure, but still, was half the battle. When Frederica Beatty invites you to join her birthday party, a sail on her father's boat with 6 other girls, 2 of whom are from the most popular set, you feel pity for Josh, who will never taste such nectar. But wait. Nobody ever pointed out that Josh, in his obliviousness, was utterly happy. He'd already taught himself the quadratic formula. He would not be stymied in any area of academic advancement. In fact, he would go on to MIT and eventually become a neurobiologist with a lab largely funded by the NIH and a vast budget at his disposal. He would marry a perfectly attractive, if rather knock-kneed woman and spawn several knock-kneed bespectacled nerds, replicas of himself. It will all work out more than fine for him, and he will never for a second suspect that it could have been otherwise. He will not know there was a social test. He will not know that he failed it. No, a sail on Frederica Beatty's father's boat was an honor that he dreamed not of, and his yen for society, such as it was perfectly satisfied by his old clan, now a year behind him. He could no more have fashioned a mask than flown to the moon, and so he remained who he was forevermore. Femininity as masquerade, indeed. That's her high school time, where she does all right. The last little bit I'm going to read is about her and her mom, because I think for me, at least in my understanding of who Nora is and how she ends up, how things end up for her, her mom is a big part of it, and her mom is somebody who was in 1973. I'm published in Britain by Virago Press, which is the women's press, and they celebrated their 40th anniversary, and they asked all the writers to contribute a little thing for a book. And I realized that in 1973, when Virago was founded, my own mother was 40. And it was also the year of the female eunuch. It was a big year for feminism. And Nora's mom, like my mom, is somebody who was just a little bit too old. Who was of the generation of people who stood on the shore and waved as the boat went out to sea. In 1973, my mom at 40 had 2 children and had been following her husband around the world for his career, with not really any chance to have a career of her own. And I think, you know, the people of my generation. Either your mom was out there on the barricades and then was, you know, at work, and showing you an example of a liberated life, or your mom was still at home, and sort of missed that, and either wasn't, you know, well disposed towards it or wasn't. But I feel as though everybody actually of my generation has some story or experience about their relation to their mother's relation to feminism, if that makes sense. But just before I do, the last in my sort of list of not fake, my 4 things, my fakely constructed 4 things. But this is something that actually preoccupies me in everything that I write, and that is the interior life. And what I wanted to do in this novel is write a woman's interior life. You know, when she says in the passage that I read that you have a mask that sort of grafts to your face, and who you think of yourself being in your head is different from what everybody else thinks of you. But that's true. That's not just true for women. That's true for everybody. That's true for all of us. And there's a wonderful moment in Chekhov's story, Lady with the Little Dog, which is a story about a middle-aged man who's married with children, and he has many affairs, and then he has an affair with the lady with the little dog, and he really falls in love with her. And he you know, he doesn't really know how that's going to play out, but he knows that this is love. But one day when he's taking his child to school, as he's walking down the street, he thinks to himself, how can it be that the thing that matters most to me in the whole world nobody knows about? And then he thinks, this is true for everybody. And it is true for everybody. As the epigraph from my last novel was from Anthony Pohl's Dance to the Music of Time, it's not what happens to you, it's what you think happens to you that matters. And it's certainly true. We all know people who, the amazing people who have been beset by adversity upon adversity, but who describe their lives as wonderful and joyful and full of blessings, just as we know people who have had what seems like every gift and describe their lives as a misery. It's not what happens to you, it's what you think happens to you that matters. And so much of what we experience doesn't break the surface, is never spoken, is never shared. And sometimes we don't share it because that would spoil it. And that's the case for Nora. She has a whole life in her head that if she told anybody, she'd have to have a reality check. And they might say, you know, I think you might be, you know, not that in touch with what's really going on. So she doesn't want that. But to some extent, we all do that. You know, I think of it in terms of those conversations that I'm sure some of you in this room have had, where you say to a friend, so then he said, we were past each other leaving the dining hall, and he said, so what are you doing Friday night? And I said, I'm going to that party, and he said, great, right? So he said, great. Don't you think that means something? And your roommate's like, sort of hard to say. Sort of hard to say what that means. But if you don't tell your roommate, you can go around all afternoon holding in your heart like, he said great, he's going to be there too. It's going to be great, right? You can pin something on very little and carry it around for a long time. It's only when you start putting it out in the world that it's a problem. Or potentially a problem. So, you know, people said, oh, did you make your character single because you wanted to make a point about single women or single... It's like, no, I needed her to have room to have a lot of craziness going on in her head. Yeah, she needed few reality checks. You know, not that she's crazy, but she has an active inner life. Okay. Golly, I'll read quickly. I always understood that the great dilemma of my mother's life had been to glimpse freedom too late at too high a price. She was of the generation for which the rules changed halfway, born into a world of pressed linens and three-course dinners and hair-sprayed updos, in which women were educated and then deployed for domestic purposes, rather like using an elaborately embroidered tablecloth on which to serve messy children their breakfast. Her University of Michigan degree was all but ornamental, and it always seemed significant that it stood in its frame under the eaves in the attic, festooned with dust bunnies among a dozen disavowed minor artworks behind boxes of discarded toys. The first woman in her family to go to college, she'd cared enough to frame her diploma, only then to be embarrassed about having cared, embarrassed because she felt she hadn't done anything with it, had squandered her opportunity. The transition from pride to shame took place sometime soon after my birth, I think. I appeared in '67, and by 1970 her two closest friends in Manchester had divorced and moved away, reborn into the messy and not necessarily happier lives of the liberated. My brother was born in '59 when Bella Eldridge was but a tender 23-year-old. He was what she did with her precious education. As far as I could tell, she didn't burn over the consuming demands of motherhood the first time. In those days, all the young women around her were doing the same thing, discussing Jane Austen over coffee while their cloth-diapered brats wriggled around on the floor, the women themselves still almost students, glad to be absolved of worry about money and still blithe in their belief that life was long, would bring more to them than wall-to-wall carpet and a new crock-pot with the occasional dinner at Loch Ober or the Copley Plaza in Boston as an anniversary treat. She was young enough to be hopeful. There are abundant home movies and antiquated slides of baby Matthew, with his slightly Frankensteinian square head and his bright blue eyes. He looks somehow like an infant of his time, has an all-American aspect that babies seem not to affect these days. And in the background, my mother grins, her face all angles, cigarette in hand. She grins at the swing set, she grins by the Christmas tree, she grins behind the picnic table with its blue gingham cloth on the 4th of July. In the later pictures, the few that remain of my own infancy, even the daylight looks darker. Maybe Kodak had changed their formula, or maybe the world had moved on. I was a smaller, more somber child, born 3 weeks early, weighing less than 6 pounds, and with thick black hair that subsequently fell out and left me near bald for months. I look like a befuddled frog, gussied up in pretty dresses, a fat foot peeking from beneath the hem, and my brother, a strapping 8-year-old with buck teeth, eyes me askance from the corners of the picture frames. My mother is hardly in these pictures at all anywhere. She must have been taking them. There's one Christmas snapshot of the three of us, my father behind the camera. It was the year, she said, that Matthew and I both had the flu, and all of us have high color, cheeks like painted dolls, including my mother, whose long hair is a ratty mess and whose dotted pinafore is falling off her shoulder. Perhaps because of the fevers, our eyes are forlorn. Even Matt's eyes look black, and my mother's mouth is open in a half sneer, as though she were about to tell my father to cut it out and put the damn thing away. I don't remember my early childhood as unhappy. To the contrary, the only thing I feared was my brother, who was pinching mean when he had the chance. But the record, such as it is, suggests that my mother was suffering. She was only 31 when I was born, but had done it all already once and knew what she'd have to give, and knew, too, that like Sleeping Beauty, she'd waken from the baby dream to find that years had elapsed and herself pushing 40. No wonder she later threw herself into her harebrained schemes, the cooking, the sewing, the writing of children's books that nobody would publish, that she didn't even really try to publish, all of them intended to catapult her to something greater, to a world beyond Manchester, to some early fantasy that lingered still at the corners of her eyes. When I was about 7, in the week before Christmas, before, it must be said, the bookstore years, and it only now occurs to me that, my mother broke down in tears at the A&P, her face a map of blotches in the sallow supermarket light. I'd asked for something extra, a jar of Kugel maybe. Does anybody here remember Kugel? Mm-hmm. Yeah. My editor said, "What's that?" I was like, "Oh, you never had Kugel?" A jar of Kugel maybe, which the more indulgent mothers of the day allowed their children to take as school sandwiches, on white bread with butter. Your dessert as main course, the world gone haywire. And her features crumpled. "I'm so sorry," she blathered, all moist and shamefully public, as I tried to push the cart along and her with it and kept my eyes to the floor. "But there's nothing for you or your brother, nothing at all. I have nothing for you for Christmas. There's just no money left." She let out a small wail. I cringed. I had to have the dishwasher fixed, and then that stone hit the windshield on the highway, and to replace the glass, it's all so expensive. And you see, there's nothing, and I can't ask your father, I can't ask him for more, so there's nothing for you at all. I am so sorry. My mother, you understand, lived on an allowance from my father, or a salary if you prefer. He had a bank account and she had a bank account, and each month he transferred a fixed sum from his account to hers, and with this sum she managed the household. She had spent the housekeeping money on housekeeping, and there was nothing left over for gifts. Even though I was still small, I understood the basics of this arrangement. "It doesn't matter," I said, trying to console without causing further embarrassment. "I don't care about presents," although I did care and was disappointed, not least because I was still supposed to believe in Santa Claus, and this outburst seemed like the Wizard of Oz emerging from behind his curtain, an unconscionable breach of propriety and of our necessary hypocrisies. "Really," I said again, "it doesn't matter." And suddenly then, inexplicably to me as I was, but in a way so obvious to me now, she turned viperish, rageful, a temper as shameful in the A&P as her earlier tears. "Don't ever get yourself stuck like this," she hissed. Promise me now." "I promise." "You need to have your own life, earn your own money, so you're not scrounging around like a beggar trying to put $10 together for your kids' Christmas presents, leeching off your father's or your husband's pathetic paycheck. Never, never. Promise me." "I already promised, because it's important. I know." And that was an end to it. She dried up and put on her sunny smile by the time we reached the checkout, the only sign of her distress a slight smearing of her mascara. We were served by Sadie, the daughter of my old first-grade teacher, a girl who spoke very loudly and slowly as if she, or we, were deaf. She wore her brown hair in a single pigtail on one side of her head, and it looked like the handle of an old-fashioned water pump. "Mrs. Eldridge," she bawled, "so good to see you as always." "You too, Sadie dear. Looking forward to the holidays?" "You bet. Isn't it the best time of year?" "The best. I love it. Don't you love it, Nora?" Did I get that backwards? Never mind. I was too busy watching my mother to answer. As she stacked the groceries on the conveyor belt, there was an expression of such impassioned nostalgia on her face that she looked like a Norman Rockwell portrait. I could see her genuinely believing what she'd told Sadie, believing that it was the best time of year. Someone else had wept and yelled at me minutes before, and Bella Eldridge would never have recognized her. And I'll stop there. Thank you. And I'm happy, I don't know what to...
We have some time for questions, and Ms. Massoud has said that she's willing to take some questions.
Yes, sir.
As a reader, I read short stories and novels. To tell you the truth, I prefer short stories. Okay, I don't know, they're short.
It's an advantage.
I don't really recall reading a novel by you, So what I'm saying does not apply. But sometimes authors keep going on, and I'm not sure they really have that much more to say. And short story very often just has the right amount. It's a nice story, you learn about the character. I also like books sometimes where each chapter could be an individual story, kind of related to each other. But I was wondering, from the point of view of a writer, I mean, what's your preference? You like to write novels more than short stories? What's the process like in writing a novel versus a short story?
Right, which is a good question, and I think one that's relevant for all the young writers in the room, of whom, whoops, I assume there are some. I think, you know, what I actually really believe is that everybody has a breath, almost, a rhythm, and there's something that is your form. And there are some people, some rare people who are very, like athletes, you know, who are really good at rowing crew, but also great at lacrosse. But there aren't that many of them. You usually have the thing that you're good at. And I think somebody like Alice Munro, do you read her short stories? Right. There are entire novels. There's an entire novel in an Alice Munro short story. She's somebody whose breath is just such that she can encompass a great deal very efficiently. And she's actually said, I think, that whenever she reads novels, she feels like, ah, I could have done this shorter. But she's fairly exceptional. And there are other sorts of short stories that aren't trying to encompass the whole world, that aren't trying to be a novel in a short story form, but are a different sort of short story. Then there are people for whom poetry is the rhythm. And I'm somebody, the novel has always been my, it's always been my rhythm, if you will. It's what I love to read. I love the stories of Alice Munro because I feel like I'm reading a novel. But by and large, given the choice, I'll read novels rather than stories. And if you give me a doorstopper, I'm very happy. And I think it's how I think also. It's how I conceive of the world. I'm the sort of person who digressions are endless. So I feel that actually it might be a really useful exercise for me to write some short stories, but it isn't something that's natural for me. But I think everybody just as people write different sentences, and you know, you can recognize, I mean, we can all recognize a Hemingway sentence, but a Faulkner sentence is a completely different sentence. A Proust sentence. Think of, you know, the sentences of Proust. They tend to be much more syntactically complicated, and most of them are compound, complex sentences. There's rarely a declarative sentence. It's actually more varied than one, you know, than we all let on. But he certainly has a rhythm that is different from a Hemingway rhythm. I think that happens on all levels. It happens on the level of the sentence, and it happens again on the level of of form in a bigger way too, in stories and stories versus novella. I mean, I love a novella, right? I love a novella. That seems like a great. That's short, but a novel. That's good for me. I like that.
When you conceive of the story, do you sort of have an imprint about these three-act structures, and look at, is that just something intrinsic? Just like somebody would go out and run and you have a certain pace that you usually keep to? Do you have that kind of, is that imprinted on you?
You know, yes. Yes. I feel as though, and I can't say why or how, or, but I have some sense the way the butcher, you know, you say, I want a pound of ground beef, and he just does it, and then he puts it on the scale, and he's maybe 1 ounce off, and you're like, wow. And then you think, well, I guess he's been a butcher for 20 years. Like, you get to know what a pound feels like. In the same way, I think I do, when I conceive of something, I have some sense of its scale. I have some sense of its rhythms. It is like music. I think there's a lot of music in prose, not just in poetry, but in prose also, and in the shaping of things. And I think there's some, the reason why, as writing teachers, we all tell everybody to read, 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 is because that's how you internalize those things. It's like being the butcher and weighing the meat. Like you just, that's the way you do it, is by reading. And my husband gets annoyed because I'm fairly obsessive about I just love narrative. Like I can't really watch reality TV shows, but I can watch really crappy, really bad dramas. Like I can watch anything with a story. I can just sit there and watch it. And I'm the annoying person who says, you do realize that, you know, we don't know it yet, but she's the ex-wife of the, like I'm that person. It's just because I think that's how it is in my head. It's just always that way. So.
Do you have any ideas about people? I recently diagrammed a book, which is a fairly compulsive thing to do.
Yeah.
Of 22 pages of it.
Your diagram is 22 pages? Wow, that's really a serious diagram.
Well, the diagram actually got down to 1 page, but 22 pages of matrices.
Right. Uh-huh.
Is that, like, do you have other ways? And all my life I've read and watched movies just watching them.
Right.
But now I'm really trying to pay attention.
To the structures. Yeah. I mean, I think you know, I once heard Diane Johnson, do you see who she is? Well, she's both a novelist who wrote The Shining. I mean, the film, I got that backwards again. She's the scriptwriter who wrote The Shining, but she's also a novelist who's written a lot of novels, including, there was a series called Le Divorce and L'Affaire, and they're sort of quite sophisticated comedies set in Paris. And I remember her giving a talk on structure, and she absolutely believes in, you know, precisely what you're doing. But the bottom line I mean, sort of taking it from the other side, not taking apart existing things, which she also believes in, but she also believes, and I'm with her on this, that an outline is a really useful thing to have, even if you don't end up using it, if you end up changing it radically. It's just a useful thing to have. It's like having it's like having a roadmap, you know, and then we will pass through this town and this town and this town and this town, and then we will get to Atlanta, right? And it's just useful, even if you then change your route. So.
Do you ever find yourself getting discouraged when you're writing? Like, oh, I don't think this is good, or no one's going to want to read this, or maybe I should change the character around.
Daily? I mean, I think it sort of goes with the, I had a friend in college. He wore like Frenchy scarves, and had a trench coat, and like he was very proud of the fact that he handcuffed his foot to the desk. Yeah, he was like, I handcuffed my foot to the desk. But sometimes you need to do some version of that. You need to be your own super ego, you know, and your id is going to say, and when it gets hard, you know, when it gets hard and you feel it's not right, it's not going well, right? And you feel like it's not coming out right, of course the impulse is, then I should just stop and, you know, go meet my friends for a drink instead. But that's actually the time, well, it may actually be the time to go meet your friends for a drink in that moment, but in some general way, it is the time to persist. Which is why sometimes an outline is helpful. Right? You can say, okay, this part's really hard, but, you know, in the sort of Buddhist way, wait, and it will change. I've got somewhere else I got to get to in the novel. I got to move on. So I'm gonna, and I'll come back and fix this later. And now I'm gonna move on, right? Rather than getting mired in something that really is getting you down. You know, people write in very different ways, and some people write on note cards and then, you know, arrange them afterwards, right? Nabokov did that. So that gives you the freedom. You're like, you know what? Note card number 320 is not going well. I'll go back to number 140, you know, and just move it around, you know.
Quick question. What's the purpose of shock value when you're writing?
What's the purpose of shock value?
I should tell you, I was driving in my car listening to the book, and I almost ran off the road.
I'm so sorry.
No.
I'm glad you're here.
It was fine. But I was just curious to know what your answer to that question would be. Was an answer.
There was something in the book that you were shocked by.
Yes.
late in the book?
Yes.
Yeah. You know, there's this weird way in which was it meant to be shocking? I guess on some level it was, but it was meant above all to be something possible. It was meant to be plausible more than shocking. So I feel it's, I mean, I guess shock would be like sex in a novel, right? You know, that whole discussion, like, what is erotica? No. What is literature? And what is erotica? And the answer is, you know, or porn. Like, well, the answer is if it's for its own sake, if it's sex for its own sake, then it's porn, right?
And this wasn't just reading your everyday 50 Shades of Grey. That bores me.
Right.
But this was...
But I guess what I'm saying is that I don't believe in shock for its own sake. I don't believe in shock for its own sake. I would hope that if something is unnerving or unsettling or disturbing, that it has that it then has. One of the words I overuse is resonance. That it has some resonance outwards. That it actually is thought-provoking or you know, and also, as I say, that it seems real. You know, I recently was asked to write an introduction for a reissue of a Serbian writer named Tishma, Alexander Tishma, who was born in 24 and died in 2004. His contemporary, who's much better known as Danilo Kish, if you've come across him. And Tishma, if you might imagine, he came from the city of Novi Sad, which is on the Danube, at the Hungarian border. And it's a city that changed hands back and forth between the Nazis and the communists in the course of World War II. And he was born in 1924, so of course he was, you know, 16 when the war, 15, 16 when the war began. So all his novels are basically about the war, and the war specifically in this place, Novi Sad, which is, because it's on the river and because it's a crossroads, it's a place where there are Serbs and Hungarians and Croats and Jews and Germans, everybody all mixed up together, and in historically all intermarried in ways that play out in his novels. And reading it, I was shocked on almost every page, and in the best way. And it's one of those things where I want to press it on people, but I can't possibly say, you'll enjoy it, because they won't enjoy it. But they might have some really, it might be a life-changing experience to read his work.
T-I-S-H-M-A?
You know, the sh sound is made by one of those little accents, so it's T-I-S-M-A. And it's being reissued by the New York Review of Books Classics.
Last question. Yes, Beth.
Do you, when you're writing your book, do you read other literature, or does the entire story just kind of live in your head and in your writings, and you can't be part of other literature?
That's a wonderful question, and I read interviews with people where they're asked that, and they say, "Oh, I can't possibly. I only read nonfiction when I'm writing fiction, or I only, you know." But the truth about me at this point in my life is that I'm such a shambles that if I only read, or if I didn't read fiction during the time I was working on a novel, like, I would never read fiction. I would just never read it because it takes me so darn long to do anything. You know, things drag out over months and years, and so so the answer is I just, you know, I'm just bumbling along. I can absolutely imagine a world in which I was sufficiently focused that I wouldn't. And I think there are times of intensity, like when, you know, there are times of intense focus when that's true. And I think there are also people there's specific books you don't want to read at specific times. But in some general way, you know, I can't go to sleep without reading. How would I go to sleep?
Well, there are books to sign, and people who didn't get a chance to ask questions, please come up and buy a book and get it signed and ask your question there. And let's please thank Mrs.
Thank you. And thank you all for coming.